And Australia is set for a grand reopening. Fully vaccinated tourists will be welcomed back after 2 long years of the pandemic. And for a closer look at what's next, we're joined by Will Hodgman. He's Australia's High Commissioner to Singapore. Mr. Hodgman, from Fortress Australia now to Australia reopened and welcoming. Australia is an example of how a country navigates a novel pandemic. Take us through the hard choices that must have been made at every transition point.
Yeah, thank you, Waisu, and Dawn for allowing me to be on the program tonight and to talk about what is another very positive step in Australia opening its borders, ensuring that its economy remains one of the strongest performing in the world, but also where not only livelihoods but lives are also well protected. And that's the balance that all governments have to make, and Australia has done well in each respect. But it's now time for Australia to fully open its international borders. They have been open for some time. In fact, back in November of last year, the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, announced the commencement of a staged process, which included an early pilot with Singapore, which exemplifies the very special relationship between our countries. And since then, around 580,000 people have travelled into Australia. But as of the 21st of February, any person from across the globe that is fully vaccinated and is a visa holder will be able to enter Australia. So that will be important for Australia's economic recovery, but it will also be manageable with Australia ensuring that our health system is adequately protecting Australians at home, but also those who will visit our nation.
We hear your optimism, Mr. Hodgman, that now is the time for Australia to reopen. But the story on that reopening to international visitors, it might not end here. The spread of Omicron, that forced a change of mindset on Australia being zero COVID. So in principle, perhaps another variant might again change Mr. Morrison's mind on reopening. What safeguards are there in place so that if changes need to be made, there will be minimal damage to confidence, perhaps, in those international travellers?
Yes, and it would be a very brave, perhaps foolish government anywhere to be categoric about what they might do into the future. And even now, it's important that governments are able to manage very rapidly changing circumstances. And Omicron indeed did present an entirely new set of challenges for nations across the globe. So what Australia has done is take a very systematic and staged approach, as I say, which is managing the health risk for Australians back home. It's allowed people to return to our nation, and will increasingly that will become more possible. But our health system, as I say, most importantly, has been able to manage the COVID and Omicron surge, which is still relatively small compared to other nations, but significant. But there's been around a 23% drop in hospitalisations, importantly, and around 23,000 active cases now in the nation. Of course, a nation of 25 million people, just to put that into perspective. And around 274 in ICU as we speak. So I say that just to provide some context, although this is a very serious and rapidly changing virus, as we've found over the last 2 years. Australia's systems are now in place to ensure that we, as a nation, and especially those sectors that rely on international aviation, most notably tourism, business travel and students, and there have been hundreds of Singaporeans who've come back to Australia, including many students to commence the year ahead, are able to be well protected. But of course, when circumstances change, it requires a government to change its approach too.
Mr. Hodgman, you spoke about economic recovery. Of course, more than 660,000 people in Australia are dependent on the tourism industry just for their jobs. You've got the Qantas CEO being very upbeat on what's happening today from Mr. Morrison. But of course, on the other hand, you've got the chief executive of Tourism and Transport Forum being rather less so. She said it's not as simple as just turning on the tap. Now, you have worked in tourism when you were Premier of Tasmania. You handled the portfolio for tourism. If you look at just Tasmania, is it so simple as turning on and turning off a tap after a 2-year pause?
Oh, absolutely not. There are obviously critical elements of a successful tourism industry, and I was fortunate enough to be Tasmania's Tourism Minister and Premier when our tourism sector experienced an enormous surge and a boom, and that was due to several circumstances of aligning and Tasmania's excellent brand and all that we offer, not just in Tasmania but across the nation, is something that's generally enjoyed by people from across the globe. So what we have to offer remains valid, but of course access and ease of access is the most critical thing for a nation, an island nation like Australia. It's absolutely essential that we have some consistency across aviation routes. There will be a difference between those carriers that have been more active, and whilst Qantas, I'm sure, will redouble its efforts and again become an important connector between Australia and the rest of the world, but especially Southeast Asia and here in Singapore, I do know that Singapore Airlines, and this is another great illustration of the really precious partnership, the friendship between our nations, has been active in the air over the last 2 years, notwithstanding the global pandemic, helping getting vaccines into Australia, getting people, Australians especially, back home, but also bringing fresh produce back up here into this region and into Singaporean markets. So I'm sure that Singapore Airlines will also be ready to go and to meet what should be, I hope and expect a pretty rapid uptake in aviation, tourism and business and leisure markets.
Thanks for that. Will Hodgman, Australia's High Commissioner to Singapore.